Hi everyone. So in today's PowerPoint, we will focus on Chapter 9, Style and Language. In this slideshow, we will cover what is style, choosing your words, rhythm and word choice, and using language that uses us cultivating awareness. So what is style exactly? Aristotle collected his remarks on style under the Greek term lexis, which literally means word. And what was meant by word was the way or manner in which one said something, also known as style. So Aristotle said style concerned word, the actual language that we use, and then diction. So if you think about the Greek term lexis, how many of you knew that that literally meant word? And then we could translate word into style. And then if you think about a car that you see on the road, the Lexus, would you say that that is a stylish car? And if you answered yes to that question, well, we might want to thank the Greeks for that. So moving on centuries later, so you know that Aristotle, he was the father of classical rhetoric, and then centuries later, Cicero was known as one of the greatest orators of his time. And that got him into some trouble, which you'll learn about from the lesson on Cicero. That's a lesson on Cicero from Rome. And this is a narrated PowerPoint, so you may not be able to play it now, but I've included that video lecture, which you need to watch because you will be tested on some of the material in there. But that was taken from when I was in Rome this past summer, and I decided to provide a lesson on the 5 canons of rhetoric. And what better place to do it than right there in the Forum, the Roman Forum. So Cicero, he argued that it's not what you say, but it's also how you say it. And I just want you to think about that for a moment. It's not what you say, but it's how you say it. And that really rings true because you can say that you look fine. But if someone says to you, if you ask a person, how do I look? And they say, you look fine. They're telling you you look fine, but then you're listening to the tone of their voice, perhaps the way they look when they're actually making that comment, and then you may not actually believe that you look fine. So today, some argue that image is everything, and it isn't everything. However, it is something, and so that's something to remember. Today, image is not everything, but it is something. Communication scholars would argue that image isn't everything, but knowing this is what distinguishes the good public speaker from the superficial one. So what is meant by that is that if a person is lacking in substance and in content, but they have a really smooth, sophisticated style of delivery, that as a critical thinker and as a listener, you shouldn't buy into the smooth, stylish delivery, because what is most important is the content of the speech, not how it's necessarily delivered. Having said that, though, image is important as well. It's not everything, but it is something. It is important to be mindful of how you do deliver a message to an audience. So it seems a bit contradictory, but the truth is it's not everything, but it is something, and that would be the bottom line. So fast forwarding, moving on to defining style for our time. So yes, we've skipped many centuries here, but moving from Cicero to today, defining style for our time, style really has become a more encompassing concept due to the importance of image. So that explains why there's so many different understandings, definitions of the word style, and it crosses a wide variety of genres of speaking to musical performance to the clothes we wear. So as a student of speech, some things that you need to consider is what is your personal style? So how do you want other people to see you? How do you want other people to view you? That in part is determined by what your personal style is. And your personal style is comprised of your demeanor, your disposition, your personality, how you dress, how you talk to people. That's part of your personal style. And then the second one is how do you present yourself to the world? So you present yourself in a certain way to certain groups of people. You might present yourself one way to your friends, to your teachers another way, and then to your employers even another way. Or you may not. It just depends on who you are and what your style is. But what you want to think about is what is your personal style trying to communicate to other people about who you are as a person? And the other thing is you want to make sure that you take your style, your signature style, and just be you. When you are presenting, it's you, maybe a little bit more formal and amplified. So whoever you are, that's who you need to be. A little bit more formal and then amplified. So for me, my personal style is I'm a little bit reserved. I can be a little sarcastic at times, and that's just kind of part of my personal style. So I would never try to be anything like a Tony Robbins. And if you've ever seen Tony Robbins before, he's a motivational speaker. He's someone, he has a lot of energy and he's yelling all the time and he's cursing all the time and people love him. And he just has this type of woo personality, extremely dynamic, but that's his style. So I would never want to mimic his style because that's just not who I am. And then the audience would be able to sense that I wasn't being authentic. So if I could impress upon you the importance of your own personal authenticity, that you bring yourself as you are so that it fits the constraints of the speech and the audience that you have in front of you. So it's you, a little more formal and amplified. So that's something that you want to keep in mind in public speaking. You always want to be who you are. Now, when we look at style as a meeting of the body and language, you want to think of style as a marriage between left brain and right brain, between thought and body. And interestingly enough, there are some scholars who would make the argument that the body is much more intelligent than the mind because the body knows first, before the brain does. And the body lets you know, but you don't always listen to the cues that you get from your body. So how does that apply to speech? Well, in public speaking, you have your disposition that you're working with, your personality that you're working with. So that's part of it. And then your body language is often unconscious. So if you haven't taken a course in nonverbal communication and you weren't really socialized to read nonverbal cues well, number one, your own nonverbal cues that you send, and number two, the nonverbal cues of other people's. If you weren't really socialized to pay attention to those things, your body language is often unconscious. So as a student of speech, it's your job to make it conscious, and this will serve you very well. So being able to read body language will serve you well in interviewing. It will serve you well in moving up the ladder with whatever job it is that you choose to take on, whatever career you take on. Being able to read nonverbal communication is a really important skill. So what you want to do is when you watch your speeches, look at your body language. And if you're doing something, I will probably point it out, but if I miss something, you should always go back and watch your speech so that you're more conscious of what you are communicating through your body language. Are you communicating that you are confident? Are you communicating that you are competent? Part of that is determined by your posture, by your use of gestures, by your eye contact with your audience. Is it direct, frequent, and encompassing? And then your tone of voice, and then your rate of speech. So you want to be more conscious of the body language, the nonverbal cues that you send, number one, to yourself, and number two, to other people. And that leads us to impression management. So what is impression management? We manage the impression that we want to make with other people. And I'll start off with online impression management. Think about it like this so it might be easier to get. How do you manage the way other people see you online? So whether or not you have an Instagram account or you use Snapchat or Twitter. So how do you manage the way other people see you? What types of pictures do you post? And what does that communicate to other people about who you are as a person? Do you only show yourself having fun? Do you only show yourself as looking like you're just having the time of your life? Or do you sometimes show images of you not so having a great time? So think about how you try to manage the impression that you make with other people online. And then think about in face-to-face interactions, how do you manage how other people perceive you? And part of how you do that is through how you dress. Part of how you do that is through how you communicate to other people. Part of that is your personality, your disposition, your attitude, your demeanor. So you manage the way other people see you through X, Y, and Z. And so it's really important as a student of speech to realize how you actually try to manage how other people see you, and then take it a step further in public speaking. How do you manage how other people see you before, during, and after your speech? So something to think about: choose your words wisely. Meanings are in people. So in communication, we understand that meanings aren't necessarily in the words themselves, but meanings are in people. And so what does that mean? I will skip down to connotative first, and then we'll go to denotative. So connotative, that's not a dictionary definition of a word, that's denotative. But connotative is your understanding, your connotation of specific words. And depending on who you are, where you're from, what your past experiences are, how you were raised, what country you're raised in, etc., all of these perceptual filters affect how you come to think of certain words. So you have to have a point of reference. That's the denotative, that's the dictionary definition. But then the connotative might mean something different. So if I say the word dog in Bali, you might not have a frame of reference. You might think dog in Bali, and then you might just get a picture in your mind of this scruffy brown dog, and you wouldn't be too far off from the truth. So over here on the right in this PowerPoint slide, here's a little dog in Bali, and I would take all of them home if I could. But I was not allowed to take a single dog out of Bali when I was there, but they were absolutely adorable. So here's a little dog in Bali, and when I think of dog in Bali, I think of this one. I was on the beach in Bali, and it was literally the day after an earthquake, and I was afraid of a tsunami, but fortunately there was no tsunami. And this dog just kind of took a liking to me, and he just hung out with me all day, and it was truly sad that I had to leave him. But this is what I think of when I think of dog in Bali. Those eyes, they're just absolutely precious and just so soulful. And so that's the connotative understanding that I have when I think of dog in Bali. This little guy comes to mind. So think about the understanding that meanings are in people. So if you didn't have that experience or a similar experience, you may not have the same connotation of dog in Bali as I do. So it's important to try to be as concise with your words and adapt them as much to your audience so that you are on the same page. So to understand that misunderstandings can easily occur, and that's why as a student of speech, you need to be as concrete and descriptive and concise with your language so that there is less room for misunderstanding and uncertainty with your audience. So moving on to choosing your words, other things to consider. Number one, what is appropriate to say to one audience may be entirely alienating to another audience. So if you are a politician and you are talking to a group of coal miners in West Virginia, the way you communicate with them is going to be a little bit different than the way you communicate with a group of politicians in Washington, D.C. So it's going to be different. The language that you use is going to be different, and the examples that you use will also be different. And you have to take that into consideration whenever you're writing your speech. Who is my audience? So ask yourself these 3 questions. Is my audience familiar or unfamiliar to me? So are they familiar to you or unfamiliar to you? Number 2, are you an outsider or an insider? So are you part of the group or are you not part of the group? So think of it like this, in-group versus out-group. If you are part of the group, then you can be a certain way with an audience. And if you're not part of the group, then you really have to build your ethos, your credibility. If you're out-group, you really have to build that credibility with your audience. And then the other question to ask yourself is, should I be formal or informal? You're taking your audience into consideration, and should you be more formal with them or more informal with them? So those are the 3 questions that you should ask yourself when you are deciding how to write your speech and what content to put in your speech and which words to use for your audience. So consider these 3 questions over here on the left if you were to present to this audience. So if you were at the Women's March, and would you be familiar or unfamiliar? Would the audience be familiar or unfamiliar with you? Are you an outsider to this type of group or an insider? And should you be formal or informal? And there is no right or wrong. It's contingent upon who you are as a person. And then consider these 3 questions with this audience. So if you were at a Trump rally, and then you would ask yourself those same 3 questions. Is the audience familiar or unfamiliar with you? Are you part of the in-group or are you part of the out-group? So these are questions that you would want to ask yourself with this audience as well. And same thing, it's going to be contingent. The answers are going to be contingent upon who you are as a person and how people relate to you. So that's something that you always want to think about, is how are you going to choose your words? And then that is going to be contingent upon the type of audience that you have in front of you. Now moving on to expertise and credibility through word choice. So expertise refers to having knowledge or skills particular to a given field of context of public speaking. Expertise is closely related to credibility. So your speaker credibility is determined by the audience's perception of you. So I'm going to say that again. Credibility is determined by your audience's perception of you. That is why it's important to ask yourself these 3 questions. Does my audience trust me? You got to think about that. Do you think that they trust you? Does my audience see me as competent? Does my audience see me as knowledgeable? So it's really important to ask yourself those 3 questions. And if each one of those is a no, then you need to figure out how you're going to get your audience to trust you, how you're going to get them to see you as competent, and how you're going to get them to see you as knowledgeable. So those are really important questions to ask of yourself, because you need to build your ethos, your credibility with your audience. And it's not determined by you, but it's determined by your audience's perception of you. So part of how you can build trust is, if you're talking to an audience, you might try to build trust through establishing some common ground, how you are like your audience in certain ways. Does your audience see you as competent? How can you get them to see you as competent? You can be organized, you can be professional in your demeanor, you can be sincere. And then how can your audience see you as knowledgeable? You can be fluid in your delivery of the material. You can cite facts and make sure that you cite the sources along with those facts, and those facts come from reputable, credible sources. So those are 3 questions that you want to ask yourself with regards to credibility. So choosing your words mindfully. So you want to keep the following guidelines in mind. You want to use simple and concise language. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but you want to make sure that you're not using million-dollar words. Writing for the ear is different than writing for the eye. So in a public speaking class, you're writing for the ear. You have to remember that. So you would write your speech as you would speak. Be accurate with the language that you choose. Avoid any technical jargon. So you want to keep the jargon to a minimum. Be really concrete with the imagery that you use, and then use powerful language. So we'll talk in a minute about powerless language, but powerful language is using words, using language that is direct, that is concrete, and that isn't powerless, which we'll talk about in a minute. So in choosing a speech, so over here on the right, this is my little Bella, and she's a snowshoe Siamese. So let's say I wanted to give a speech about the traits of the snowshoe Siamese. And if I were thinking about these guidelines, keeping them in mind, I might want to use real simple language in talking about the traits and be real concise with my language. So I might say something along the lines of the temperament of a snowshoe Siamese is a very playful, energetic, vibrant little creature who's extremely affectionate and loves to be around people and can be quite vocal. So I tried to use real simple, concise language, be accurate, and then if I wanted to describe the snowshoe Siamese by using concrete imagery, I could say you can look at the paws, and the reason why they are called snowshoe Siamese in part is because their little feet have little white paws like they've been dipped in the snow. This isn't just an example of how you can follow the guidelines when you're choosing your words mindfully. And then moving on to rhythm and word choice, something to remember, like I said before, and I'll say it again, writing for the ear is different than writing for the eye. Remember, you are writing for the ear. Keep it simple. So you want to develop a style that encourages memory and audience interest. You want to use vivid language, concrete and descriptive. You can use repetition and rhythm, alliteration, different tropes, figures of speech. We have metaphors using simile, irony, so that's all in your textbook. Make sure that you go over the different types of, the different stylistic devices that you can use in your speech to make it more interesting. And what I'd like you to do is there's a video clip in here, and I'm not going to play it right now, but this too, I'm actually going to put this in your discussion post assignment for this week, but this is a commencement speech. It's just a clip, a Will Ferrell commencement speech, and you're going to need to identify the different figures of speech that are used in this commencement speech. So it's a funny one, and that will be in your discussion post. So I'm going to skip over that right now. So moving on to the last main idea, using language that uses us, cultivating awareness. Rhetorical scholar Kenneth Burke, the father of modern rhetoric, famously asked, do we simply use words or do they not use us? And many communications scholars positively interpreted this question by arguing that we communicate meanings that we don't intend to communicate all the time. So we do it all the time. And that really goes back to meanings are in people, not necessarily in the words that we use. So we know that it is important to be mindful with the words that we choose to use, but it's also important to be mindful of the audience that we're speaking to, that we try to understand them as best as we can. So in doing so, we want to avoid certain types of language, and the first here is biased language, and that refers to the use of words and phrases that indicate unfounded assumptions about others based on personal experience. So really, we're human beings, we all have a tendency to be biased, and part of why you were going to college is to get educated and to help you see beyond some of the biases that you are conditioned to see. And what does that mean? So as I said previously in this slideshow lecture, was that we all have perceptual filters, and that's our race, our gender, our social class, sexual orientation, religious affiliation or not, country that we're from, family that we're raised in. So we have all these perceptual filters, and they filter the messages that we receive and that we send to other people. The bottom line is that you want, as a public speaker, you want to do your best to be respectful of the differences within your audience. And when you're using language that stereotypes other people, that you're mindful of the assumptions that you are making about a group of people. So one of the most common types of biased language I get as a teacher is old people. So people have this idea that all old people are this way or that. And it's really short-sighted to think that all old people are a certain way. And it's really ludicrous. And it's just as ludicrous for older people to think all young people are a certain way. Really, it's just taking the time to understand groups that may, at least on the surface, appear very different from you. So as a student of speech, it's very important to be mindful of the language that you use and mindful of the assumptions that you're making about people, because you're basing it on your own personal experience and your own perceptual filters. So that's why part of why you're here in education is to uncover some of those assumptions that you make about people. Number 2 is sexist language. You want to try to avoid the use of sexist language, and again, making any assumptions based on gender. So if you think all males are supposed to be a certain way or all females are supposed to be a certain way, you want to try to avoid that. And currently in North American culture, we're moving more toward the use of generic pronouns, and that's to be more inclusive. So instead of saying he or she, just they or them or their. And you might say, well, it's not really a big deal, but it is, and it can be a big deal. An example that I like to use, and I don't know if it will come across since I'm not in the flesh here giving a lecture, but do your best to stay with me. So here's a story, and I want you to think about what your assumption is. So here's the story. So there was a father and a son, and they were going on a camping trip, and they were having the time of their life, and they were driving, and then they get to the spot, and they're setting up the tent, just having a really good time together. They had really great quality time together. And then the son injures himself, and the father's like, oh my God, this is life or death. I've got to get you to the hospital. And so he is miles and miles away from a hospital, and he doesn't know if his son's going to make it, and he's going to definitely have to go into surgery. And so he finally gets to the hospital, and then he brings him in, and the surgeon comes in to take a look at the boy, and the surgeon says, my son. So just think about that for a second. If you had all thought, well, how could that be? Because the father was the one who brought the son in. And could you at all have thought that the surgeon was actually the mother? So you may or may not have, but it's just something to think about, is that sexist language is all around us, and we don't think about it, and it's just important to think about it. The language that you use, and you want to include people, so you want to use inclusive language. And the other one, which is a real simple one, is, and I hear it all the time as a speech teacher, is saying you guys. Instead of saying you guys, just say you all. And then finally, actually not finally, there's 2 others. So there's slang, and you're not going to find powerless language in your textbook, but I wanted to include that because it's extremely important as well. But you want to do your best to avoid slang, so that maybe you and your friends have a certain slang that you use, but you wouldn't want to use that in a speech, especially a formal speech. So just there are some exceptions, but generally you want to avoid the use of slang. It's an insider language, and if the audience doesn't get it, then they perceive themselves as being outsiders, and then the whole goal for you to connect with your audience just has been lost. And then finally, with the use of powerless language, examples of powerless language would be things like hedges. So if you hear yourself saying things like sort of, kind of, those are hedges, and it indicates to the audience that you're not really sure of yourself. Maybe you aren't a competent speaker. You also want to make sure that you avoid tag questions. So that's the little question that you add on to a statement. So if you make a statement and then you say, don't you think so? And that's just a tag that indicates to the audience that you're unsure of yourself. Disclaimers are also really important to avoid. If you say something along the lines of, I'm not feeling really well, everyone, so this isn't going to be my best speech. So that's a disclaimer, and then again, you're losing credibility as a speaker. You just go on stage and you just give it your best, and you don't have to provide a disclaimer at all. If you say, I'm not really a specialist at this, but... So again, just you avoid the disclaimers. And then the last one is intensifiers. So you want to make sure that you don't use too many intensifiers, such as very clearly, obviously, amazing. So that really, again, takes some of your credibility away as a speaker. So instead, you want to use powerful language that's more direct, concise communication. So what did we cover today? We covered a lot. What is style, choosing your words, rhythm and choice, and using language that uses us, cultivating awareness. So a question to ask yourself again, what is your personal style?